everyone, you've tuned into Anime Huddle, coming straight from Radio LUMS, and this is your RJ Namrah speaking. Welcome back to another episode with us, and this time we're going to go back in time to talk about a more rustic and historical anime called Samurai Champloo. So to give you a bit of background on the series itself, it aired from May 2004 to March 2005, and it happens to capture a unique aesthetic of the early 2000s with its fusion of history and bold anachronism in one genre. It also is directed by a familiar and recognized name in the anime industry, Shinichiro Watanabe, who you might know better as the director of Cowboy Bebop, another staple of Japanese anime. For Watanabe, his major objective in the creative process for Samurai Champloo was to undertake a heavier, a more whimsical project in contrast to Cowboy Bebop, and to combine classic samurai fiction with hip-hop. And for the most, the series does offer that. Set in Edo period Japan, the series is fun and laid back, never taking itself too seriously, but at the same time keeping the audience intrigued by the fast-paced premise and the characters of Mugen, Jin, and Fu, who we think we've got figured out, but at the same time don't. This unique trio are as different as can be from each other. You've got your heroine Fu, a pretty airheaded girl to all appearances, who's on the search for a samurai who smells of sunflowers, who also happens to be her father. She meets Mugen, who's a vagabond, and Jin, who's a ronin, the Japanese term for a samurai who doesn't serve anyone, and through a series of events manages to get them to help her on this quest with the deciding factor of a coin toss. That's the basic outline. And for us, we're going to try to pick at the bare bones of the series in this episode, talking mainly about the legacy it left behind, what exactly is the show trying to get at, and how do we reflect on it now. So kicking off with the legacy surrounding Samurai Champloo, we need to talk about the historical backdrop first. So despite having a focused time period like the Edo era in Japan as a setting, there was an attempt to not conform too much to that history and give the impression that the anime was something like the likes of a nationalistic statement. So history was depicted in an unusual form in the series, with real people, real events that happened to be used as the stage for the fictional world of Samurai Champloo. Take for example Mugen. We mentioned that he's a vagabond, but that doesn't mean he doesn't belong somewhere, right? Mugen was born on the Ryukyu Islands, which is a penal colony in this period for Japan, and was later annexed. It's an area that's often regarded as the forgotten colonial history of Japan, and the complexities surrounding its acquisition and the aftermath are too long for us to get into, but we'll give you some context in terms of what the show used. So, within the time period of Samurai Champloo, the Edo area, piracy was a major problem that these natives turned to in order to survive, just like Mugen, and the people of Ryukyu gained a reputation for infamy and for being criminals. So a lot of the disgust and fear we see on the part of other characters when Mugen reveals he's from these islands is a real anxiety that director Watanabe portrayed. There's this dilemma of Japanese citizens who consider themselves more ethnically pure than these Ryukyu Islands natives, and then also the negative perception of these natives, because they were driven to acts that were a part of the dark underbelly of society, because of the way they were positioned within the structure of that society. But if we're talking about the history in Samurai Champloo, the main way in which it's been utilized, turned into an almost anti-history, is in an anachronistic way. We mentioned this term in the beginning of the episode, and if you're unfamiliar with anachronism, at its simplest, it's to ascribe something to a time in which it didn't exist. And if you're watching Samurai Champloo, expecting it to be a faithful adaptation to history, you're going to be severely disappointed, because Samurai Champloo is anachronistic to its very core, and that's part of what makes the series so much fun. Take the fighting scenes. You'd probably expect smooth and seamless moves from samurais, but instead you get this broken and jarring fighting style that's obviously borrowed from breakdancing. Or episode 5, in which we're introduced to Hishikawa Morinobu, a ukiyo-e artist, which is a style of Japanese art, and he hasn't made it big yet. His art pieces are displayed alongside famous artists like Kuniyoshi, who came about 200 years after him, and he's supposed to have made it big before him. Historically speaking, it's the incorrect chronology, considering that Morinobu was one of the earliest artists of this art form. Or take another example with episode 23, that was entirely about baseball, which had originated in 1876, and while Samurai Champloo hasn't specified the exact years in which it's taking place, other than it being set in Edo, Japan, it does seem to be heavily drawing from the early 1600s. So while the entire show is littered with obvious examples of such anachronisms, perhaps a more subtle way in which director Watanabe introduced this concept was in the characters and the beliefs he tried to push. If you go through the show, you'll notice that there's this effort to include people who were cast off from society back into society. So the rehabilitation of the social misfits, or at least trying to look at them with a more sympathetic lens. There is a strong tolerance for minorities and cultural acceptance that Watanabe also includes. But having talked about the basics of the history of the show, let's go to one of the most well-known and renowned aspects of Samurai Champloo, its music. The show itself was influenced by a musical genre, hip-hop. To Watanabe, this genre functions to refresh the past and to make it edgier, especially with its sampling, which is what he tried to do with Samurai Champloo, sampling Japanese period dramas to create a new type of animation. A direct quote from Watanabe explains why he was so fascinated by the form of rappers. It is said that Japanese people read between the lines, so they do not feel out of place and keep their heads down. But I always have this suspicion, like, is it always been so? Is it just a behavior of such a modern Japanese? It brought me to create an opposite character who boasts like a rapper with a microphone, and it should be like a samurai. So the anachronistic approach to sound design by Watanabe makes sense. I mean, the word Champloo itself comes from champuru, which means to mix or refers to stir fry, and we constantly see this quality of blending or mixing throughout the show. But beyond seeing this aspect present in original soundtracks, you can also hear it in the editing of the show, which feels as if someone is playing around with a vinyl record, like how record scratches are used as a method of transitioning between scenes. The legacy of Samurai Champloo would probably not be as impactful or as incorporated into popular culture if it hadn't been for its unique music. Take Nujabe's influence in shaping lo-fi hip-hop. This music that combines the tempo and flair of hip-hop with a jazz undertone creates some serious eclectic tunes. This in part inspired many artists to experiment around with such unorthodox combinations of music that culminated in the establishment of the lo-fi genre as a prototype of its current form by the end of the 2000s. Over time, it proceeded to carve out a niche of its own on the internet, gaining a massive audience in the process, and further inspiring more derivations of this style of music. And within the medium of anime, we can also see the impact of Samurai Champloo's soundtrack. Thanks to this series as well as other shows, anime nowadays is quite bold with the way they utilize music, not just as a supplementary tool to the story, but also as a standalone aspect of the show that can be admired on its own. From mainstream shonen adaptations marketing their shows in collaboration with opening and ending songs from prominent Japanese artists, to seinen shows conveying the grand scale of their story and characters by incorporating orchestra melodies in their soundtracks. Music is an ever-changing form of human expression, and Samurai Champloo is a testament to it. The show's music took various genres and styles and brought them together seamlessly to produce something quite novel, and that's part of why the series has managed to stand the test of time. While not as popular as its older sibling, Cowboy Bebop, it still manages to enthrall people specifically with its music, to the point where if one were to look at the comments of any of the show's soundtracks that have been posted on YouTube, they'd find people not just praising the music, but actively remembering how the music takes them back to when they first watched it, and how very few shows can replicate that feeling. But moving from the bare bones of Samurai Champloo and more towards the flesh, let's talk about what the show is even getting at. So starting off with the themes, there's one prominent trend we see within these characteristics that the characters embody, and that's the trait of individualism. All three of the main characters have contrasting goals, Mugen does not have a care in the world for rules, and chooses to live the way he wants to, and to fight with others using his own style. Meanwhile, Jin is a stoic ronin that seeks to perfect his style of genjutsu, which is a form of swordsmanship. And Fu, while typified as a ditzy girl, is still a strong-willed jack of all trades that can maneuver her way around adversities. It's not just that the main trio are unique individuals, that they maintain their uniqueness in the story setting. As mentioned earlier, the story is set in Edo period Japan, a time period known for its strict rules of conformity and sticking with the community that it imposed on people. In this restrictive setting, we see our central trio continually getting into trouble throughout the series for refusing to conform to society's norms and expectations. And while there is a feeling of solidarity generated through the characters being united in this non-conformativity, the show stays true to individualistic tendencies, with all three characters going their separate ways in the ending. It's not quite the rejection of the community or social relationships you might think it to be, because while all three characters are moving on towards their solitary paths, they're not quite alone anymore. They're obviously still friends, and that friendship impacted all of them differently. Sometimes we need to move away from friends, whether it's paths not aligning or just the passage of time, but that doesn't reduce the friendship that had been created. To me, the ending of the show seemed to acknowledge this. Then you also have the constant rejection of authority in the show. Whether it's feudal lords, gangs, or clans, the message is clear. Watanabe does not like arbitrary authority, and through the characters we see him reject traditional hierarchies. The show depicts powerful people as lazy, selfish, deceitful, and downright unlikable in an attempt not just to create antagonistic forces for our heroes, but also to depict how absolute authority corrupts people and turns them into antagonistic forces. The show also uses two opposing concepts of time to create a contrast, the past and the present. Take Mugen, whose personality represents values we would consider modern in the brash and fearless way he expresses them. That's something that stands out to us immediately, as we observe how displaced such a personality is in Edo, Japan. This contrast between the past back then, the one of our history books, to our present, which seems firmly rooted to us, offers a point of introspection into how culture, identity, politics is constantly in flux and created by us at all times. This show highlights that there is just so much of a disconnect between who we are today from how we were just a century or two ago. But at the same time, a strange familiarity is present in how there's this desire to be true to oneself, to be free of all societal and economical barriers. But steering towards the structure of Samurai Champloo now, unlike other shows which have a central plot that is integral in making the story progress, Samurai Champloo's main story is up in the air for the vast majority of the 26-episode show. We learn in the first episode that Fu wants to meet with the Sunflower Samurai. However, rather than focusing on this narrative point, the story very rarely drops hints or tidbits of information as to the Sunflower Samurai's location and identity. Instead, the show seems to focus more on the journey of the three characters as they travel across Japan together and get into all kinds of trouble. This focus on the journey rather than the destination is not unique, but it is refreshing to see a series actively indulge its audience with a more laid-back narrative that doesn't contain an intense storyline and complex plot points. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter who the Sunflower Samurai is, because Watanabe is not interested in telling the story of that mysterious figure, but rather of Mugen, Jin, and Fu as they seek to find him. It also helps that the adventures of the main trio as they travel across Japan are quite entertaining. From Yakuza gangs to a singing swordsman, to bug tournaments and eating contests, this journey is filled with absurd and fun ideas and concepts that make this journey thoroughly enjoyable. So to wrap up our episode somehow, we need to think about how we reflect on this anime, classic that's been one of the most powerful introductions to getting a good grasp of what animation can do. We've talked quite a bit about stylistic or musical choice, but if that's all the show has, then at heart, it's quite empty. You don't ever hear much conversation about the plot, with there being varying opinions from it either losing track towards the end or copping out. Something we have to come back to in order to get perspective into this is the entire narrative driving force in Samurai Champloo, the search for the samurai who smells like sunflowers. As we learn, the samurai's existence is non-existent, by the very definition, because sunflowers have no specific smell. Therefore, the driving force, the purpose, the grand aim pushing the show, is also non-existent. This might seem meaningless, but not quite, because we learn in the end that the samurai is actually Fu's father, who abandoned her family. Her last memory was of him running through a field of sunflowers, which is why she calls him the Sunflower Samurai. This mythical figure in the series ends up being a disappointment once he's finally found, being a frail and sickly old man who begs for forgiveness from her in his final moments. Director Watanabe displayed this tendency of building up mysterious or strong characters only to tear them down in realistic and vulnerable moments to the Sunflower Samurai, although many found it to be a shame. But rather, it seems more to be a deeper reflection on how one tries to find meaning in their lives through their family, as Fu did with her father, and building up these grandiose or not to scale images of them that don't correspond with reality. In the end, one has to find their own meaning, and that's precisely what the show is telling us. Fu didn't find who she expected to, but in her journey, she did gain 2 true friends. And that's really how the show ends up resonating with you, with the portrayal of friendship through different characters who come together for a non-purpose. It's a realistic portrayal, first of all, how friendships can form with the most unlikely people in the most unlikely circumstances. As mentioned before, Fu used a coin toss in order to persuade Mugen and Jin to help her find the Sunflower Samurai. In the first half of the series, we see that neither Jin or Mugen want to be with her. Neither Mugen or Jin want to be with Fu, and would much rather just leave or fight one another. In fact, at a few points in the show, they do leave Fu, only to cross paths again. It's only as they spend so much time together that a deeper appreciation between all 3 of them grows, regardless of how different and conflicting their natures are. Sure, it's sad that they're splitting up after their shared adventure, but it's natural. Friends don't always last forever, and people drift apart over time. The key, as Samurai Champloo shows us, is to treasure these friends while we are on the same path and to have fun with them. Rather than force these 3 very different people to like each other from the get-go, the series lets them grow closer throughout the series. And with that, we come to understand why this show is so impactful. Of course, style goes a long way, with its absurd mix of Edo period Japan with modern references, bold historical inaccuracies, and an innovative musical direction, but style can only take you so far. Getting such an introspective look into the characters from a very different time period and very different culture, who should feel removed to us, is really what elevates Samurai Champloo. Maybe we can't completely claim to understand or relate to any of the characters because of all the history they carry around with them, but even so, we see snippets of ourselves and our society in their fearlessness of trying to pursue what they think is right, what they think will lead them somewhere. And so, with all that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you for tuning into Anime Huddle with Radio LUMS so far, and do look forward to the next episode.